Hopefully, you can get some good learning out of this. Almost out of water. This is a quick, probably not so quick, discussion, one-sided discussion over the Washington and Adams administration. So I got some notes here, and I might get to some pictures, etc. But for the most part, this is going to be what it's going to look like, just me uncovering some of the stuff on my screen here. So let's dive into the Washington administration by making these appear. So yeah, just some background. Um, Washington is elected in 1788 unanimously as the first president of the United States, and he is not necessarily wanting to do it, but you know, I think he'd rather be at home and his farm in Virginia. Um, but he takes the job. He stands for election. That's what it was called, standing. You weren't running for election; you were standing. He did not campaign for himself. In fact, there might not have been anybody campaign for themselves for 100 years. It might have been William Jennings Bryan. 1896 might have been the first campaigner for himself per se. I think anyway. So Washington goes in, and we're still in New York because the capital hasn't been moved to D.C. yet, and it won't. The first person to take office or to reside in the White House will be John Adams. So we're going to look at foreign affairs and we're going to look at domestic affairs. So, and I'm just going to go year by year. So things will unfold. Foreign affairs, French Revolution began 1789. Relatively early on. That's foreign affairs. In Washington's administration, he establishes a cabinet. The Constitution doesn't necessarily say that he has the power to appoint cabinet people, although it does say that he can nominate heads of executive departments. So I'm pretty sure that means the same thing. In any case, he creates his cabinet, and there's four departments. There's or four secretaries, if you will. There's the Attorney General, who is the top law enforcement officer of the country. There's the Secretary of Treasury, which we know will be Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of State, which we know will be Thomas Jefferson, and his Secretary of War, which was Henry Knox. I think Edmund Randolph was the first Attorney General. Yeah. One of the first laws that the Congress passes, one of them was to repass the Northwest Ordinance, right? They didn't even pass the Bill of Rights until 1791, so there's 2 years later. But one of the first things they do after the Northwest Ordinance is actually, this might have been even before the Northwest Ordinance was repassed, was the Judiciary Act, 1789. And it basically, the Constitution said that there could be the Supreme Court and lower courts, but it doesn't really talk about how many seats and where all those courts will be. And so basically the Judiciary Act said Supreme Court will have 6 members and a Chief Justice. As you know, the number has expanded and contracted up and down until it's been at 9 for quite a while now. There were lower courts established, 13 district courts, and I think pretty much those district courts, there was one per state. I'm pretty sure that's how that worked. And then 3 circuit courts, and those were kind of like, I'm pretty sure those were appeal courts. So if you didn't like what happened at the district level, you could go up to the circuit level. Then you could go up to the Supreme Court there on appeals. And I do believe the Supreme Court justices had to do these as well as these. And just one little thing that's going to come up later in Marbury versus Madison, original jurisdiction was given to the Supreme Court in this law over writs of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is a court command, mandamus, mandate command. Basically, that if the court wanted to issue a command to like appear in court or whatever, they could issue a writ of mandamus. Now, original jurisdiction means the court case starts at the Supreme Court. It doesn't go from the lower level and then appeal and then appeal. That's appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction was given by this law to the Supreme Court over this. The Constitution doesn't say that, this does. Hopefully you remember that when we get to Marbury versus Madison. There was a tariff. It was a compromise between a protective and a moderate tariff. Protective would mean that it was so high that imports would not come in, and it would keep our industry safe. Moderate, and this was a compromise. This is what the Hamiltonians would have wanted, and this is what the Jeffersonians would have wanted, and so there wasn't really a lot of at least not political party faction level politics involved there. So, yeah. So you can see here, it was a compromise, and there's not even really. I don't even think Jefferson himself was actually back yet. So it was more of the farming interests. I think he was still in France when this was passed. I'm pretty sure. At the very least, he had not had enough time to get a political party going. So, yeah. Okay, so that's 1789, first year. Yeah, no big deal, right? Let me uncover this right here. So in 1790, Hamilton has been thinking about what are we going to do with our nation's economy? We've got to get it back on good footing because we had a really healthy economy during salutary neglect under Britain, and then the Articles of Confederation, and of course before the Articles of Confederation, there's always a depression or a recession after a war because government spending, just demand in general, just goes down. So that, and then the Articles of Confederation, just the bad state of the economy and the money not being worth anything, not worth a continental. So you get Hamilton devising a plan that you all know a little bit about already. And he issues his report on public credit, and it was dozens of pages long, which back then was a big deal. So the federal government should assume state debts to domestic and foreign creditors are incurred up to that point. You pay for it by issuing bonds. This would mean that a bond is something the government says, you give us money now, we'll give you money back later plus interest, which means the government would be in perpetual debt. And Hamilton was okay with that. Because if the government perpetually owes you money, you would want the government to be successful so they could pay you back your money. Otherwise, you'd lose it. And you pay off your debts, you make your debt payments by having an excise tax on whiskey, which was almost a form of currency, pretty much. Actually, it was a form of currency in some places. It was so ubiquitous, meaning it was everywhere. And of course, the tariff as well. Congress said okay to paying off the $11 million owed to foreigners, the debt that Americans, public and private, had to foreign nations. But they did not like the idea of assuming $27 million of debt already that the federal government owed, plus another $25 million that the states owed. they had to pay off the Revolutionary War banknotes that they had issued to soldiers, etc., and other securities, other um, IOUs at face value. That's what Hamilton wanted. He wanted to pay everything off at face value, not at a discounted rate, which is something that a government can do, apparently, although it probably isn't fair. Remember that some states, like Virginia, if New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Our debts are paid, I'm afraid. Don't tax the South because we got it made in the shade. There is a phone call. Hold on. I'm doing a video. What do you want? Who is it? Mr. Conley. Okay. Uh-oh. No. Oh, the basketball pitch, yeah. That is impossible this year. It might look like I'm pregnant, but no. Yeah, yeah. I can't, man. I'm sorry. Do it. Do it. Okay, gotta go. Don't do it. I gotta go. Bye. That was Mr. Conley. I could probably edit that out, but maybe you were able to take a break to get a drink or something. So anyway, some states had agreed to pay off the debt, so they didn't want the federal government to assume the debts because then the whole country would be bearing the debt of only the few. Um, and then some others hadn't even touched it, mostly northern states. And of course, that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison all got into the room where it happened and made a bargain where they decided to, the two sides negotiated. They would move the capital eventually to a federal district, District of Columbia. Columbia, of course, being another name for America, named after Christopher Columbus. It'd be along the Potomac River, which would be Northern Virginia. And then the people, the Hamiltonians, get their funding of state debt at par, the assumption of state debt at par. You notice here Washington had to borrow money to relocate to Washington, D.C., to relocate to the capital of New York. Right, yeah, some of these founding fathers just weren't great with money. Jefferson died deeply in debt. So the capital was moved to Philadelphia for the time being. And then in 1800, it permanently landed in D.C., and that's when John Adams moved into the White House, and Congress came down there too. Hamilton's reasoning about this: if the federal government assumes the debt, then the citizens will want the federal government to succeed so that they can be paid back. Foreign nations will want the United States to succeed because they'll get their money back too. So it's like win, win, win. This is the first sectional compromise apart from the Constitution, and kind of apart from this tariff. But this was the first major post-constitutional compromise, and it seemed to make everybody happy enough. The Indian Intercourse Act was passed in 1790. Basically, the original intent, I think, was to help treat Native Americans with more fairness. And so, if you wanted to trade with Native Americans, you would have to get a license, a federal license to trade with them. In theory, then that would make your trading with them more legit and more humane. you'd be more honorable because you could get hauled in from the court, federal court, if you didn't. It also said this Indian Intercourse Act, and no, intercourse doesn't mean what you think it means here. It just means just people having interactions, okay, economic interactions, okay. It also said the only legal means to I know what you're thinking. Stop thinking it and stop laughing. You hear that? Stop it. Okay. The only legal means of getting land from Indians was through treaties. That's the only way you could do it. Anything else was illegal, and that was the intent. Obviously, we know that's not what happened, but that was the intent. Same year, speaking of Native Americans, there's a guy named Josiah Harmar, an American general, fought a battle in Ohio against Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, two Native American chiefs, and Josiah Harmar lost. There's actually a Blue Jacket. Silence. It's my phone. There is a outdoor drama for Blue Jacket as well. It's not as good as Tecumseh, but it's not bad if you want to go up and watch that somewhere sometime. Also in 1790, Hamilton issued his report on a national bank, and here he said this was issued later on. A bus or a Bank of the United States is needed. We need to put our money somewhere, and we can use this money productively, right? You know how banks issue loans with the money that's in their vault, and then they get that money back with interest. Well, the National Bank could do that. It could take tax dollars and not just pay off debt, but actually use to make more money. So it would be a public corporation, so it would be government incorporated, and it'd be funded by private investors, and then they would get a return on their investment, and money could be loaned out to people who needed money, to especially things like buying land, which would be good for the country. Narrowly passed Congress. Washington wondered if it was constitutional. He even said to his cabinet, let's talk about it, because he would have discussions with all of his cabinet members, and they would talk about things even if it wasn't technically their area. And Jefferson argued for strict constructionism, which basically means if the Constitution doesn't give you permission to do it, then you can't do it. It has to specifically say, you can do this, President, or you can do this, Congress. It doesn't say specifically enumerated that Congress has the power to make a national bank. And so Jefferson said no. He didn't like moneyed interests anyway because, well, he was not good with money, but also because he thought that they would, rich, wealthy, elitist people would take advantage, right? Hamilton responded with the argument that if it's not forbidden to do it, and if it's necessary and proper, which is called the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, if it's necessary and proper to do all the other stuff that you need to do, what are you going to do with all that tax money? Congress has the power to tax. What are you going to do with it? Just going to put it in this, stuff it under this big national mattress? Is it necessary and proper to have a bank? Maybe, because we can need somewhere to house that money. So loose constructionism, ask for permission second. Do it first, ask permission later. Forgiveness later if you need to. Little Turtle comes back in 1791. He defeats Northwest Territories governor, Arthur St. Clair. It's the worst defeat, like strategy-wise, numbers-wise, etc. by the U.S. government, military in history versus Native Americans. Not a great way to start out the year for President Washington with all of the infighting that had gone on in his cabinet here and between the two different sections of two different parties that are starting to form. This is not a great way to start the year off with this news either. Bill of Rights were ratified. James Madison really gets the credit for getting those through Congress because everybody else had said, every other Federalist, for the ratification of the Constitution, those Federalists, they had told the Anti-Federalists, if you ratify the Constitution, you get a Bill of Rights, and nobody else in the Congress really cared about it. So Hamilton really shepherded those through. 12 ended up being proposed, and 10 were actually ratified. One of those, two that didn't get passed, became later the 27th Amendment. Don't ask me what the other one was because I don't know. I can't remember. Hamilton issued his third major report. It was his report on manufacturing. Not as successful as the two, but it also shows you part of his vision for where the country's going to go. And it's going to be manufacturing and commerce and business and banks, not centered solely around farming like Jefferson wanted. Not as successful as the two. He wanted a protective tariff, so higher tariffs, and those tariffs would protect our manufacturers from foreign competitors. A bounty is just another way of saying, and in this case, not like we're not talking about like bounty hunters, bounty for your head. We're talking about government subsidy, money given to the government, by the government to private folks to encourage their business. That is right in my. Anyway, which way am I? Dang it. I'm right in a bad spot here. Okay, let me. You can see little Batman back there now. Okay. Yeah, the Jeffersonians didn't want this. They didn't side with the moneyed interest. They sided with the common person, quote unquote, even though Jefferson was not a common person, nor Madison. This time they won the argument. They didn't want to trade British rule for New York rule. And so there you go. Really, where the money was going was in shipping and land speculation. It wasn't going into manufacturing at the time. Later it will, but not yet. The overall effect of Hamilton's plan was to see tariffs raised slightly. They became a little bit more protective, but not as much as he'd wanted. The Bank of the United States provided economic stability, and it was up for renewal in 20 years. It could be recharted in 20 years. The charter would expire, and they'd have to be renewed. Foreign investment increased. The bank notes. Now, there's no dollar bills per se yet, but the bank notes that are being issued act as a currency of sorts. You'd go, if you get a note from the Bank of the United States that says, this is good for exchanging $50 worth of gold or whatever, then it would be trusted around the country, and people would honor that in theory. So it's that important currency stimulated business and activity and so on. And basically Hamilton's plan overall started the United States out on a solid foundation. Had Jefferson been Secretary of Treasury, 1792, we're about halfway through Washington's first administration. No, we're getting to the Washington second administration. No, sorry, he was unanimous. unanim, unanim, unanimously, I said it right that time, reelected by the Electoral College, with John Adams being the vice president again. The French Revolution turns really bloody and violent with the Reign of Terror and the beheading of their king. So that's 16 if you don't know how to read Roman numerals. Just wait, that'll come up. Chronologically, the next the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was John Jay, the first one. He had written some of the Federalist Papers. They were awful. That's a great time too. Right? His his Federalist Papers were bad. They were so boring. Anyway, he's Chief Justice, and there's this case, Chisholm versus Georgia. There were residents in South Carolina, and they sued not a Georgian. They sued the government of Georgia, the state government of Georgia, and that scared some people because I could sue any government I wanted then and win lots and lots of money. Like, oh, it could cause lots of problems, right? It'd be chaos. And so there was an 11th Amendment passed as a result of this 5 years later. And this 11th Amendment said no state can be sued by citizens of another state. State governments can sue each other. That's what the Supreme Court really was for, was to decide between disputes between states. And the citizens of a state can sue their state government for rights violated, but citizens of another state can't sue. Citizens of one state cannot sue the state government of a state where they don't live. So back to this. By the time news reaches and we learn about how bad it is in France, almost all of the cabinet is arguing for neutrality. Don't go over there and fight. Because, especially Hamilton, if we stay neutral, especially, and I didn't put it up here, especially when Britain starts to attack France because of this, if we stay neutral, then we can make a whole bunch of money because we could trade with both Britain and France, right? We could make tons and tons of money. And isn't that what it's all about, right? Jefferson was kind of at first like, let's wait and see. But if France calls on the Franco-American alliance, then he would argue for it. He didn't think they would, but Hamilton said, let's suspend the treaty immediately. And Jefferson, no, you can't do that, right? There's a guy named Citizen Genet. I think he was a minor noble that was part of the revolution that came over to America from the revolutionary government. And he went around the country, the eastern seaboard, like from south to north, all over the place, asking for money from crowds to support France that he could use to take back. And as an ambassador, he was sent to the United States as an ambassador from France. He started commissioning privateering raids against Britain. If you don't know what a privateer is, it's legal piracy. You've been given permission by a government to be a pirate, right? It's like Jack Sparrow with government credentials. Americans started applauding the fact that the French monarchy had fallen, just like the Americans had overthrown their monarch, right? And some were willing to go to war against Britain because they still remembered it hadn't even been 20 years yet, it hadn't even barely a decade, right? 15 years since that the Treaty of Paris had been signed, and so Hamilton said, "No, our best trading partner right now is Britain. We've been trading with them for almost 200 years. Better not stop that." And they also feared that there would be mob violence, especially against the wealthy, just like there had been in France. And and so Citizen Genet was just whipping up a mob frenzy, etc. Washington, if you've watched Cabinet Battle #2 from the Hamilton musical, you know that he responded with the Proclamation of Neutrality, officially neutral. We will not uphold our treaty with France. We will stay officially out of it. So basically breaking that treaty, making it null and void. It was about this time that some people who were very, very Jeffersonian, if you will, began to pop up all over the place. All over the place. North, south, backcountry cities. They're called democratic societies. They supported the French. They were against the president's proclamation. They kind of felt like they were latter-day Sons of Liberty, like the Sons of Liberty come back again. Kind of like lobby interest groups from today, pressure congressmen to do, maybe give congressmen campaign money, whatever, to do what they were asking. These democratic societies really scared the Federalists, like to death. Not really to death, but right. There's like, oh my goodness, there's a French Revolution coming here because this is how it started in France. Citizen Genet, eventually, because in France the power shifted back and forth between different groups that were cutting each other's heads off, and he fell out of favor in France, and his party lost power. His influence started to diminish, and Jefferson had kind of supported him, and Washington didn't like that because, Washington had, told Citizen Genet to cease and desist. And now that Jefferson is kind of like a little bit backstabbing President Washington, like he loses credibility with Washington. And so, by the turn of 1794, Jefferson has resigned as Secretary of State. He's out of the cabinet, and he's now in charge of his own faction, Democratic Republicans, and what they print in the press against the Washington administration and Hamilton, but also Washington too, is pretty rough. Add to that, to these problems. Washington told Genet, you can't do this. You can't go around saying this, and Citizen Genet did anyway, right? And so Jefferson looks really bad now. Add to all this, Spain. Spain is slowly kind of nipping at our heels in the West. They're claiming lands south of the Ohio River, and so south of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachian Mountains, which was given to the United States by the Treaty of Paris. They had built forts. You see there, Vicksburg and Memphis, Mississippi and Tennessee. Today, they were supplying Indians with land, and the Native Americans would favor the Spanish land claims there instead. They closed New Orleans to shipping. Now, if you don't know why that is a problem, just think of the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, and the Missouri River. They all come together, and then all of that all of those farmers bringing all their product to market, all of them are flowing down to Mississippi, down the Mississippi to New Orleans at the very bottom of the Mississippi River at the very southern end. And if they are going to close New Orleans to American shipping, then American farm goods are not going to go anywhere. And American farmers are going to go bankrupt. And then that's going to be a big problem because 80% or more of American economy is based on farming, right? There's even some rumblings that some of the Western farmers were thinking about rebelling and seceding just so they could get their crops sold, right? Joining Spain. On top of that, Fort Miami was built. These are British people in the Ohio backcountry making a fort to our Fort Miami, near where Miami University is now, I think. They made this fort, and they are going to. It's against the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris said that the British would leave all those forts, and now here they are building one, right? So, yeah, they're saying that they're keeping their troops, the British are, in the Northwest Territories, even though they're not supposed to, because the Americans had not paid off their Revolutionary War debt yet to British merchants. So that was their excuse. This is bad. You take all these things together. Like by 1794, Washington's diplomatic situation looked bad. Genet had thumbed his nose at him. The federal government couldn't kick the British out. We're getting thumped by Native Americans in battle. And we couldn't keep the Spanish from closing the Mississippi and from, slowly creeping up. So I guess there are even secret agents that paid Americans bribes to cause more problems. West of the Appalachian Mountains was killing Washington's administration, not to mention the infighting in his own cabinet that had gone on, right? And the factions that have emerged between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. Add to this, Britain starts to confiscate American ships and start to impress American soldiers into their fight against France. If you don't know what impressment means, it's basically there's a British ship over here, there's an American ship over here, they're passing each other. The British ship stops the American ship, boards them, and says, "Hey, those guys over there, they deserted from the British military, so they need to come with me." It was basically like a form of slavery, They might have been deserters, and most of them probably weren't. And they were told to come. And they were made to serve in the British Navy. Then, add into that the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion occurs. There's more like a currency, as much a currency as a beverage. Water that you drank back then, especially in towns and cities, was probably polluted by human waste. So whiskey was a thing to drink that was, sanitary, even though it would make you drunk. It was a part of their way of life. It was kind of like a currency. Like, if paper money wasn't worth much out there, then they could make whiskey and trade it for goods. The tax on whiskey was hurting backcountry folk, and so they protest. They erect whiskey poles, which is kind of like the Liberty poles that had been put up during the American Revolution. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, just like we had done during the Revolution, and there was direct links to the democratic societies that were against the Washington administration. And so I think at this point, Washington's had enough. He's going to do something. He's the commander-in-chief. He raises a militia of at least 12,000, if not 13,000 troops. and they go out to Western Pennsylvania. Now, I don't think Washington went all the way because he was 60 something years old. He went back after a certain time, and Hamilton continued out there. But when they got out there, they pretty much found that there was no real true rebellion. I think that show of force quieted down. There's maybe a couple shootouts. That's really it. Obviously 13,000 troops are going to outnumber any random whatever. There were two culprits who were considered the ringleaders of this thing, and they were caught and they were put on trial. They were convicted. They were guilty, but Washington pardoned them, showing that he's not like the French Revolution, right? But he shows that he's willing to use force. 13,000 troops is nothing to sneeze at. And he shows that when it comes to federal matters, that the federal government you have representation now. So taxation by the federal government is fair. Federal government supreme over local matters. Then, to help Washington out too, Mad Anthony Wayne might have literally been mad, right? Defeated Blue Jacket at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. There was this place where there had been a tornado up in northern Ohio, or maybe it was border of Indiana. Actually, I think it was on the Indiana side. Looked like there'd been a tornado, just knocked all these trees down. Battle of Fallen Timbers, and Mad Anthony Wayne beat Blue Jacket. Fort Miami, where the Native Americans were running to after they got defeated, the British, even though the British had supplied them, closed the door to them. Of course, Mad Anthony Wayne couldn't get them to leave, the British to leave the fort, but he defeated Blue Jacket. He crushed this Native American opposition, and it seems like between the Whiskey Rebellion being crushed and this major battle right here, that Washington's fortunes are starting to swing back towards the more effective and more successful. This battle leads to the Treaty of Greenville, which basically, Native American tribes in the Northwest Territories pretty much are giving Ohio, Indiana, Detroit, Chicago to the United States without any problems. Britain is still there in the Northwest Territories, but that's what this next thing is about. Jay's Treaty. We got to get those British troops removed from U.S. soil. And John Jay, Supreme Court Chief Justice, was sent over to Britain. He got this agreed to. The British would move. They would get good trade relationships between the two, most favored nation. And the United States would be allowed to trade with the East and West Indies. So that was a big deal. We were in no position to fight them to get them out. And so we couldn't demand for reparations and we're not going to pay our debt to Britain, and you have to open up everything, all of your colonies to trade, right? Yeah, right. But it was a pretty good deal, in my opinion, considering we didn't have any bargaining chips. The Hamiltonians like this neutrality in peace with Great Britain. The Jeffersonians don't like it, because now that means that the British don't have to worry about nipping at our heels. They can focus solely on attacking France. The Southerners wanted to put into the treaty, Southerners getting compensated for all those slaves that had run away to Britain under Lord Dunmore's proclamation during the Revolution. And so there's more democratic society protests. John Jay said that he could find his way across the country by the light of his burning effigy. if you don't know what an effigy is, you just make a little doll and you pretend that it's John Jay and you light it on fire, right? You're not actually trying to kill. It's not a it's not a voodoo doll. It's, just saying you really, really don't like this guy's policy, right? So there was some correspondence that made it seem like Jefferson's party would refuse to fund the treaty. They demanded to see Washington and Jay's secret correspondence over this diplomatic affair, this treaty. Washington refused to let them see the correspondence. I don't know if that means that he was selling out the South. I don't think it means that. I don't think it means he was selling out the Jeffersonians necessarily. But for national security reasons, he said, "I'm not going to let you see this," and that is called executive privilege, when the president feels like there's certain information he should not have to share with Congress. And so those members of the House of Representatives did not see what he wanted. Now, they did not ratify this treaty at the time. There was a deadlock. And Washington, his popularity never being higher in the early 1880s is now in the 1780s. After the Revolution, he was extremely popular, and now his effigy is being burned too, along with John Jay's, right? Maybe his effigy wasn't burned. They were saying really nasty things about him in the press, though, the Democratic Republicans, while meanwhile the Federalists were supporting him, right? So enter in Pinckney's Treaty. Pinckney's Treaty, was it Charles Pinckney? South Carolina politician, I think it was Charles. There was a couple different Pinckneys. Anyway, Spain got involved in the war with France across the ocean. Spain had lost, and they basically decided that this was not the time to try to start a war with America too. So, in this treaty, they give up all of their claims south of the Ohio River. They establish a boundary for Spain at the 31st parallel, which, if I remember correctly, still gives them Florida and also, Mexico. And we don't even, want to deal with that right now. It also gives Americans the right of deposit in New Orleans so that they can actually trade. They can deposit their goods in New Orleans and then trade them to the rest of the world. This makes Southerners and Westerners happy. So the Hamiltonians require that the ratification of Jay's treaty it happen. Then we'll help you ratify Pinckney's treaty. And so there was a compromise there, and Pinckney's and Jay's treaty ended up both getting ratified. And, Washington ends his career on a high note, I guess you could say, with that. And so in 1796, he's been in office 8 years now, or going on his 8th year, and he says, I want to step down. I don't want to do it anymore. I mean, he was getting older, for one. He wanted to go home and just relax in his farm, for two. He had businesses that he was trying to run. If you've ever been to Mount Vernon, you know that he was one of the largest whiskey distillers in the country at the time. So he takes a farewell address that Madison had drafted for him earlier, I think maybe even after the first administration. Hamilton kind of cleans it up. And here's basically what it said. The context, of course, is the United States is on a more stable ground domestically and in foreign affairs. Native American threats are neutralized for the time being. But the political battle really weighed on Washington. He'd been called a traitor to the revolution by the democratic societies, by the Jeffersonians. So he decides not to run for a third term. And in it, his two major three major warnings is don't get involved, don't get entangled in foreign affairs. The United States should stay out of it because the moment we get entangled in British and French, etc. affairs, it's over for us. It'll hurt us too much. Stay neutral. Some people call this isolationism. You call it what you want there, but he also said political parties, factions in politics are dangerous and they're tearing other countries apart, like France, and they're going to tear us apart too. So watch out. Dangers of sectional loyalty, like you're not just a Southerner, you're an American. You're not just a Northerner, you're an American. Wise words. Mostly fell on deaf ears. Not the first one as much, but these last two did. I'll just remind you that Washington, in his farewell address, said that religion was indispensable for our political success, and he called it an indispensable support. Religion is an indispensable support for Republican government. And it's funny that Madison and Hamilton, who had written the Federalist Papers together, are now on opposite sides of each other. Madison is a Jeffersonian. He had said in Federalist Number 10 that a large republic would break the power of factions, like you wrote about a couple weeks ago. And even though, it's funny that something that he had a lot of hand in drafting had said, no political parties. Madison was at the forefront of creating political parties, and Hamilton responded with basically a political party of his own called the Friends of Order, the Hamiltonians. So Washington steps out. His vice president, John Adams, runs for president, but so does Thomas Jefferson. There are some disputed electoral votes. Jefferson could have disputed them. A long, drawn-out legal battle, but he decided not to for the good of the country. And so Adams beat Jefferson by 3 electoral votes. The votes were almost purely along sectional lines, and I can show you that. The election of 1796. You can see northern states, and a couple slave states right here voted for Adams. Larger population gives him the presidency, but Jefferson had nothing to sneeze at. Virginia and Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania being a northern state, so it's not total sectionalism, but it's getting there. Jefferson becomes the vice president because originally the second place vote getter would become vice president. They didn't run on a president vice president ticket. We'll find out what happens to that later. Meanwhile, France is upset by Jay's Treaty and its seemingly pro-British stance, and they start to seize American vessels and cargo. So John Adams comes in with a divided administration. Adams was a Federalist. He supported Washington during those first 8 years. Jefferson was from the opposing party. He was a vice president. Hamilton is not in the cabinet, but he's still looming in the shadows, and it seems like he's still influencing Adams' cabinet. So, it didn't start out great for Adams, but war fever hits versus France, and that helps Adams' popularity tremendously at first. Okay, so 1798, XYZ affair. John Adams, because France is still, stealing ships and cargo on the high seas and troops too, so sailors too. John Adams sends over Elbridge Gerry. I think it was Charles Pinckney. I think the same one from the Pinckney Treaty, I think. And John Marshall, who will later become the Supreme Court Chief Justice later. And he's going to have them negotiate with France over shipping damages. The French had, up to that point, taken 300 American vessels for a total of $20 million in those days. $20 million in those days worth of damages. That's a lot of money, right? They meet with 3 French diplomats who say, you cannot go to see our foreign minister, Charles Talleyrand, unless you give us a bribe first. I think this cartoon will. It's made it better than I could.
Angry at U.S. neutrality in the British-French conflict, the French had attacked a number of American ships. It was a big problem for President John Adams. The French keep attacking American ships. What shall I do? I must send smart diplomats to negotiate with French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Perigord. We are very smart diplomats. We want to negotiate. Send us to France. My dream has come true. Surely Charles Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry will successfully negotiate. Well, what are you waiting for? Get to work.
Elbridge Gerry is where the word gerrymandering comes from, if you know what that is.
Here come the foreign minister's representatives. Let us report to them as So you want us to leave your ships alone? Yes, we do. How much? I'd say pretty much. Enough to offer us a ride. Get lost, pal. France is a powerful country. You better pay. Rather fight an expensive war than pay you some stupid crime. We save millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. You'll be sorry. When Americans got word of how disrespectfully they'd been treated by the French, many wanted to go to war. George Washington was ready to come out of retirement to leave the army. Adams, however, tried further negotiation, and this time, France treated America seriously. The XYZ affair, so named because that's how Americans referred to the French representatives who demanded a bribe, showed the world that the United States demanded to be treated with respect.
That is 3 minutes that you'll never get back. Oh, look at that. Trolling on Facebook. So yeah, we're not gonna give you bribes. We're not gonna give you bribes, tribute. Millions. We'd rather spend millions of dollars on defense and not 1 cent for tribute. And so there's this anti-French hysteria hit like a fever pitch, and Adams was extremely popular because he was the leader of the country. And um, this was called the Quasi War. It was not an official war because Congress did not declare war. It's not an official war unless Congress declares war. The Navy Department was created, so a new cabinet, right? Department, tripled the size of the Army. That was authorized. Then the Navy was expanded, right? There was a Marine Corps established. Washington would have come out of retirement to lead the Army, but honestly, by this time he was pretty old and he was about ready at the end of his life almost. So I don't really think he would have done very well with that. But most of the fighting was done in the West Indies. 80 vessels that we captured of theirs versus several hundred that they captured of ours. So I wouldn't say we won per se, but you get the gist. Basically, just a little snipping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, not becoming full-fledged war. News of a major French naval loss to the British lessened the chances of invasion. Now, I think you should know what the name of that. 1798. France. Yep, there it is, the Battle of the Nile right there. If I'm correct, it was about that time when Napoleon's army found the Rosetta Stone that allowed us to translate ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs into Greek, which would then allow us to translate them into modern languages. I don't know. I think somewhere around that time. Anyway, lessen the chances of invasion, right? And while there's this quasi war going on, what are we going to do at home? Well, apparently, we're going to strip people of their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and freedom of press because the Alien and Sedition Acts were. Is Mad Dog calling me? I cannot talk right now, Mad Dog. Sorry. On Facebook Messenger. The Federalists in Congress were afraid that French immigrants would come over. Yep. Would come over and influence us and try to take us down, whatever. And so the Naturalization Act, if you want to be a citizen, you have to now, instead of living here for 5 years, you have to live here for 14 years. The Alien and Alien Enemies Act, the president can imprison people or deport them if they're suspected of being, what's the word? Not unpatriotic, disloyal during wartime. Because it's a wartime necessity, right? The Sedition Act fines and imprisonment for anyone who spoke or wrote any maliciousness against the government, which basically meant the Federalists in Congress, Federalist majority, were trying to silence their political opponents, the Democratic Republicans. As far as I know, this is the first time that the Speaker of the House, the person who is going to lead the House of Representatives, the first time that was a contested thing between the two parties, right? There was this fight on the House of Representatives floor. Between somebody from Connecticut and somebody from, where was Reagan Matt, the Democrat? Matt Griswold, where's he from? Was he from Virginia? Was he from South Carolina? Where is he from? Matt Griswold being from Connecticut. Sorry, Roger Griswold. Matt Lyon. Oh, he's from Vermont. He wasn't a Southerner. He was still a Jeffersonian, though. You can see here the picture. Like one of them took a cane, tried to attack the other. The other one grabbed the tongs out of the fireplace. Right? Like, okay, so I know politics are bad right now. They're probably just as bad or worse than this, but so far, nobody in Congress has actually, started dueling each other on the floor of the House of Representatives. Right? At least 20 or 25 major Jeffersonians imprisoned or fined, or both. Yikes. At this point, the Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, and James Madison, very influential figures, write protest documents called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution, and basically what they articulate is something called compact theory. What compact theory says, it wasn't the people of the United States who created the federal government and who ratified the Constitution. It was the states that entered into a contract together. The 13 states, not the people of the states entered into a contract to create the federal government. The federal government was the agent of, or the creation of, the states. That means, according to this theory, that the states are the final determiners of whether or not the federal government oversteps its bounds. It's not the Supreme Court. It's the states. It's not the people. It's the states. When a state feels like a federal law is unjust or takes away the rights of its people, that state can nullify the laws. Instead of judicial review, where the Supreme Court gets to determine if a law is constitutional, there's state review. States can review a law and determine whether or not it's unconstitutional. And if it's unconstitutional, then within its borders, it is null and void. This is going to be a major problem when we get to the Civil War era, because this compact theory is what Southerners are going to come back to later to protect their slaves. We're almost done. 1799, the Quasi-War is continuing. Talleyrand did not want to fight Britain and its allies and Spain and the United States at the same time. So he said he would take, as you saw in the cartoon, he would take a new envoy, treat him with respect. Adams could have said, nope, you lost your chance, and we're going to go into full-fledged war, and it's going to make me more popular, and I'm going to win re-election. But he didn't. I mean, he could have tried to get Louisiana from France and Florida from France, who I think had taken it from Spain by this point. I think I kind of went back and forth. Anyway, John Adams could have done that. He didn't. He put country above party. He put the nation above the Federalist Party, which made Hamilton angry. What didn't? But reasonable Federalists and the Jeffersonians were appeased by this. And so, Napoleon took over in 1800. I don't know if you've ever seen this picture of Napoleon. Beforehand in Europe, especially Catholic countries in Europe, Pope would come and crown the king. The Pope would come and set the crown on the king's head as a symbol of your authority to rule comes from God, and the Pope being God's representative, right? Famous picture of the coronation of Napoleon as the Emperor of France. He takes the crown from the Pope. The Pope doesn't put the crown on his head. Napoleon takes it, crowns himself. I am the final authority, not the church, maybe not God. I'm not sure about Napoleon's religion, but definitely nothing is more powerful than me. Napoleon, yikes. He doesn't want to upset America. He wants to have his hands on a new world empire. He doesn't want an enemy to fight for that new world empire. So the Convention of 1800 officially ends the military alliance that we had with France from both sides, where we had said neutrality earlier now. Right. So America agreed to pay damages to American sailors who had lost boats or whatever cargo, instead of making France pay for it. So that was Napoleon's price of peace. That leads us to the election of 1800. Adams had been very, very popular, but the Alien and Sedition Acts and the opposition that the Jeffersonians brought because of that stripping away of rights to speech and press made his popularity take a big hit. He was unpopular by the end. There was, they said all sorts of things about John Adams in the Democratic Republican press. They called him hermaphroditical, right? Just words that we wouldn't use today even, right? So, and we think that this is terrible politics. So Jefferson barely wins by 8 electoral votes. Adams does not rise up and lead an army to keep power. It's a bloodless transition of power. It's called the Revolution of 1800 because of that. It was like a glorious revolution. It was a transition of power that was bloodless, like bloodless. It was peaceful, and that's the way we've had it. And Lord willing, that will happen whenever President Trump gets unelected. If it's now, or if it's in 4 years, whatever, right? I don't think that's going to be a problem. Come on, right? He's not going to. Never mind. I don't think so. I have friends who think. I think he's trolled some people on the other side of, the political aisle about that a little bit, saying that he's owed 4 more years because of all the investigations. Anyway, any impeachment. Anyway, called the Revolution of 1800. If you want to know what this means, Burt acts the jerk, then you can listen to the Hamilton song, The Election of 1800. You can see what Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson was running as vice president. Jefferson was running as president, and Burr was running specifically as his vice president. But there was a tie, and Adams actually had the 3rd most electoral votes. Right? It was just like a fluke. It just happened, right? All the Jeffersonians had 2 ballots that they could give. That's what you had as an elector back then. You had 2 ballots, and they would vote. They would send one in for Jefferson and one in for Jefferson's running mate, which in this case was Burr, and it just happened to be a tie. And Hamilton worked behind the scenes to make sure that Burr did not get to be president. So Burr was kind of campaigning for himself a little bit. I know I said that nobody had till 18 whatever, but no successful person had ever won presidency campaigning for himself until 100 years after Washington. Anyway, Hamilton gets the Federalists to help sway the election towards Jefferson, even though he doesn't like Jefferson at all. He definitely likes Burr less than he likes Jefferson. So there you go. In 1804, we'll get the 12th Amendment, which will basically say the president and the vice president have to run on a ticket, and the electoral votes will go to the ticket, not to one vote to each. But there's this lame duck period after the election, from November of 1800 until March of 1801. Adams is still in office, and at the last minute, he signs a ton of appointments to Supreme Court and the lower federal courts, which solidifies the court system within the Federalist control. The presidency goes to the Jeffersonians. Congress switches in March of 1801 over to the Jeffersonians, but the Federalists keep the judicial branch. And these are called the midnight appointments because Adams was, kind of signing some of them even at midnight, right? And the Senate was approving them pretty quickly. So, and that includes John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because of John Adams appointing him. And we will see why the name William Marbury matters. Okay, thanks for your attention. I want to show you real quick the electoral map of 1800. The biggest thing I think that helped Jefferson was that Jefferson got New York. If he hadn't, Adams would have won. So there you go. Hopefully this was helpful. It's a long one. Sorry, but it was 2 presidents. So have a good weekend.